In 1923, amidst the golden age of Egyptian discovery that saw tombs yielding treasures of unimaginable splendor, a British expedition led by the esteemed Sir Malcolm Croft unearthed a burial site in a forgotten corner of the Valley of the Kings. It was designated KV-64, a tomb unlike any other. The initial reports, whispered in the hushed, gaslit tents of the excavation camp, spoke of iconography that defied convention. A female figure wielding the flail of a pharaoh, depicted with the authority of a god, intimately entwined with the jackal-headed Anubis. Rumors of a lost warrior goddess of the underworld began to circulate through the parlors of London and the halls of academia. The world held its breath, anticipating a revelation that would rewrite the Egyptian pantheon. But then silence. Within weeks, the tomb was unceremoniously sealed with a thick concrete plug, its entrance buried under tons of rock and sand. Sir Malcolm Croft's official expedition summary dismissed it as a minor, late-period intrusive burial of no significant historical value, its contents poorly preserved and academically irrelevant. All field notes, photographs and preliminary sketches were confiscated under the newly tightened antiquities laws Croft himself had helped draft, and they subsequently vanished into the labyrinthine archives of Cairo, lost to time. The story of the warrior goddess became a footnote, a piece of romantic folklore for conspiracy theorists and amateur historians. The truth, it seemed, was buried deeper than any pharaoh. But 100 years later, a signal from space, a ghost in the machine of modern geology, would challenge that carefully constructed silence. It would reach out to a man living in the shadow of that long-forgotten failure, a man who believed the truth was not just waiting to be found, but demanding to be heard. Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant Egyptologist ostracized for his radical theories, sat in his cluttered London flat, surrounded by the ghosts of his own ambition. His career had stalled, his papers rejected, his voice muted by the academic establishment that revered the very man who had crushed his family's legacy, Sir Malcolm Croft. Eris's great-grandfather, Arthur Thorne, had been the lead surveyor on that fateful 1923 expedition, a meticulous man whose career and spirit were broken after KV-64 was sealed. He died a few years later, a disgraced and rambling figure, leaving behind only fragmented, maddeningly vague notes about a heresy in stone, and a truth too dangerous to see the light of day. For Eris, KV-64 was more than a historical curiosity, it was a wound, a generational injustice. He had dedicated his life to piecing together Arthur's cryptic warnings, a quest that had led him to academic ruin. He argued that Croft hadn't found something insignificant. He had found something paradigm-shattering and deliberately concealed it. This theory, which flew in the face of the deified Croft's legacy, had made him a pariah. The establishment, particularly the powerful Cairo Antiquities Council, led by Croft's ideological successor, Dr. Halim Zahi, ensured Eris would never work in Egypt again. They called his obsession a fantasy, a desperate attempt to vindicate a failed ancestor. And so, he was trapped, a researcher without a dig site, a historian without access to history, his only companions the fading ink of his great-grandfather's letters and the bitter taste of what might have been. He stared out at the rain-streaked London streets, the weight of a century of silence pressing down on him. The mystery of KV-64 was a cold case, its secrets entombed in rock, archived paper, and the unassailable reputation of a dead man. The world had moved on. But history has a long memory, and technology has a way of revealing what is hidden beneath the surface. Unseen, unheard, the Earth was about to give up its dead. Half a world away, in a sterile, climate-controlled data center in Tokyo, a junior technician named Kenji Tanaka stared at his monitor, his brow furrowed in concentration. He worked for a commercial satellite imaging firm, his job a monotonous cycle of processing ground-penetrating radar scans for mining corporations and geological surveyors. The data streaming in was from a routine sweep of the Theban necropolis, commissioned by the Egyptian government to map subterranean water tables. It was background work, something to occupy the overnight shift. But something was wrong. Amidst the expected geological strata and the faint, ghostly outlines of known tombs, one specific location pulsed with an anomaly that made no sense. In the precise coordinates of the Valley of the Kings, adjacent to the recorded location of the sealed tomb designated KV-64, his screen displayed a void. A perfect, geometrically precise void. A chamber hidden, deep, and clearly artificial, sitting just meters away from the known tomb, but with no connecting passage visible on the scan. It was an architectural impossibility, a secret room attached to a forgotten crypt. Kenji ran the diagnostic again, then a third time. It wasn't a glitch. It was real. A knot of excitement and fear tightened in his stomach. Standard procedure was to flag the anomaly and forward it to the client with a brief, technical note. It would be buried in a geological report, likely overlooked by a bored bureaucrat. But Kenji was an amateur historian, a fervent follower of the internet's more esoteric corners. He knew the legends of KV-64. And more importantly, he knew of Dr. Eris Thorne. He had read Thorne's rejected papers, followed his ostracization on academic forums, and felt a kinship with the disgraced scholar's passionate pursuit of a fringe theory. To the establishment, Thorne was a crank. To Kenji, he was a hero, the only person who had ever dared to question the official story. He sat for an hour, the cursor blinking on his screen, torn between professional duty and a thrilling, terrifying impulse. To send this to the Egyptian government meant it would fall into the hands of the very people who had silenced the story in the first place, the disciples of Croft. It would be buried again, perhaps forever. But to send it to Eris Thorne, that was a risk. A career-ending risk. But it was also a chance. A chance to put the key into the one hand that might have the courage to turn it. With a deep breath, Kenji composed a short, anonymous email. He attached the raw GPR data, the spectral analysis, and a simple message. Dr. Thorne, I read your paper on Croft's curated history. I think you were right. Look west of KV-64's burial chamber. Something is there. He hit send, his heart pounding. The signal, a stream of binary code carrying a century-old secret, shot across the globe, an invisible arrow aimed at the heart of a London flat. Eris was dozing in his chair when the notification chimed, a small, insignificant sound in the quiet room. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another rejection letter or a bill he couldn't pay. But curiosity, the scholar's oldest instinct, compelled him to look. The subject line was blank. The sender, an encrypted, untraceable address. His finger hovered over the delete button, but the brief message caught his eye. KV-64. The letters seemed to hum on the screen. He clicked open the attachments, his breath catching in his throat. The data flooded his monitor, complex, layered, and utterly breathtakingly beautiful. He was fluent in this language of shadows and echoes. He saw it instantly. The clean lines. The right angles. The unnatural emptiness were there. Should have been solid limestone. It was a tomb's antechamber, and next to it, where nothing should be, was a second, larger chamber. A hidden chamber. It was exactly as his great-grandfather's most delirious notes had described it, a dual structure. One for the world, one for the truth. For a moment the room spun. The dust motes dancing in the sliver of moonlight from his window seemed like ancient spirits. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It wasn't a family obsession. It was there waiting. The satellite had seen through 100 years of lies, through concrete and stone and the weight of a powerful man's reputation. A jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline surged through him, clearing away the fog of defeat that had shrouded him for years. The despair was gone, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. They had lied. Croft, the council, all of them. And now he had the map. His eyes, burning with a new fire, scanned the data again. He knew what he had to do. The cost didn't matter. The risk was irrelevant. This was the moment his entire life and his great-grandfather's life had been leading toward. He was going back to Egypt. The price of the one-way ticket to Cairo consumed nearly all of Eris Thorne's meager savings, a reckless gamble on a ghost in a machine. He landed in a city that felt both alien and intimately familiar, the air thick with the scent of jasmine, exhaust fumes, and the dry, ancient dust of the nearby desert. He felt the oppressive weight of the history he sought to rewrite pressing in from all sides. His first and most formidable obstacle was the Cairo Antiquities Council, the gatekeeper of his quest. Housed in a grand, colonial-era building that seemed designed to intimidate, the council was the modern incarnation of Sir Malcolm Croft's legacy, and its current director, Dr. Halim Zahi, was Croft's most devout acolyte. Zahi was a man carved from the same unyielding stone as the monuments he protected. With a perfectly trimmed mustache, immaculate suits, and an air of utter infallibility, he presided over Egyptian history as a personal fiefdom. He had built his international reputation by reinforcing Croft's established narratives, and he viewed any challenge to them not as academic debate, but as sacrilege. Eris, clutching a briefcase containing the printed-out satellite data, was granted a brief, perfunctory meeting. He was led into Zahi's cavernous office, a room decorated with portraits of past directors, Croft's severe face looming largest among them. Zahi did not rise to greet him. He remained seated behind a vast mahogany desk, steepling his fingers and regarding Eris with an expression of weary condescension. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice smooth but cold. "I confess I was surprised to hear you were in Cairo. I was under the impression your particular field of study had reached its conclusion." The insult was clear. Eris refused to be baited. He opened his briefcase and laid the spectral images on the desk. "I have new data, Dr. Zahi. Evidence of a significant, unrecorded subterranean structure directly adjacent to KV-64. I believe it warrants an immediate survey." Zahi glanced at the papers for no more than a second, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. "Satellite data. We receive dozens of these anomalies a month, Dr. Thorne. They are almost invariably geological echoes, water fissures, or natural karst formations. The desert is full of holes. It does not mean they were put there by pharaohs." "This is not a natural formation," Eris insisted, his voice tight with forced composure. "The geometry is too precise. It is an artificial chamber. Given its proximity to a tomb that was sealed under mysterious circumstances by your predecessor." "Sir Malcolm Croft was a giant in our field," Zahi interrupted, his voice hardening. "He was meticulous. If there had been anything of significance in or near KV-64, he would have found it and documented it. His report was unequivocal, a minor, late-period burial. To suggest otherwise is to question his integrity, and by extension, the very foundation of this council." The message was unmistakable. This was not about science, it was about dogma. The conversation was over before it began. Zahi pushed the papers back across the desk. "Your request for a survey permit is denied. The area around KV-64 is geologically unstable. We will not risk a team or the integrity of the surrounding tombs for what is clearly a flight of fancy. I would advise you to enjoy the sights of Cairo and return to London, Doctor. There is nothing for you here." As Eris was escorted out, the finality of Zahi's words chilled him more than the air-conditioned halls. He was locked out, his single piece of powerful evidence dismissed without a second thought. He stood on the steps of the council building, the cacophony of Cairo swirling around him, feeling the familiar sting of defeat. But as he watched a hawk circle in the hazy sky above, something shifted within him. The dismissal wasn't just procedural, it was defensive. Zahi's reaction had been too quick, too absolute. He hadn't examined the evidence because he was afraid of what it might show. He wasn't protecting history, he was protecting a lie. A new resolve hardened in Eris's gut. If the official doors were closed, he would have to find the back ones. He remembered a name from his great-grandfather's letters, a junior archivist on Croft's team, an Egyptian man named Farid al-Masri. If anyone had seen what really happened in 1923, it would have been him. The chances were slim that he was even still alive, but his family might remain. Eris now had a new mission, a hunt not for a tomb but for a memory, for a human connection that might have survived the century of silence. He turned away from the grand facade of the council and walked into the sprawling, chaotic heart of the old city, a man searching for a ghost in a city of millions. The archives of the Egyptian Museum were a necropolis of paper, a silent, dusty city holding the memories of 1,000 expeditions. To Eris it was both a sanctuary and a prison. Without an official permit, access to the sensitive early 20th century records, especially those of Croft's expeditions, was impossible. He spent days petitioning, calling in old, tenuous favors from university colleagues who were now reluctant to even be seen with him. He was met with polite refusals and sympathetic shrugs. The shadow of Halim Zahi was long, and no one dared to cross it. Defeated, Eris retreated to the public reading room, sifting through general catalogs and published expedition summaries, hoping for a crumb, a single misfiled reference. It was during one of these frustrating, fruitless searches that a stooped, elderly man shuffling by with a cart of books paused beside his table. The man's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a cloudy but intelligent gray. "You search with a hunger that is not academic," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "You are not here for what is on the shelves. You are here for what is not." Eris looked up, startled. "I'm sorry? I am Yusuf. I have been a librarian here for 50 years. I know the look. It is the look of a man searching for a ghost. You are Dr. Thorne, are you not?" Eris nodded slowly, a prickle of caution on his neck. "How did you know?" "Zahi sent a circular with your name and photograph," Yusuf said, a flicker of something, amusement or perhaps conspiracy, in his eyes. "A warning to all department heads. You are not to be given access to any primary source material related to Sir Malcolm Croft's work. The confirmation of his pariah status should have been disheartening, but the way Yusuf spoke gave Eris a sliver of hope. Then you know why I'm here. I know you are the great-grandson of Arthur Thorne. A good man. A careful man, Yusuf whispered, leaning closer. I knew his friend, Farid al-Masri. My uncle. He told me stories when I was a boy. Stories of a tomb sealed not to protect it but to blind us. Stories of a truth that terrified the Englishman, Croft. A jolt went through Eris. This was it. The human connection. Did he leave anything? Notes? A diary? Yusuf shook his head sadly. Farid was a cautious man. After your great-grandfather was sent home in disgrace, he burned everything. He said Croft had eyes everywhere. He was afraid for his family. He took his secrets to the grave. Eris's hope plummeted. It was another dead end. Seeing the despair on Eris's face, Yusuf hesitated, then made a decision. Farid burned his own notes, he said, his voice barely audible. But he did not burn his friends. He gestured for Eris to follow, leading him away from the public areas, down a narrow spiral staircase into the sub-basement. The air grew cooler, thick with the smell of decaying paper and preservation chemicals. They entered a small, cluttered office that was clearly Yusuf's personal domain. From a locked metal footlocker beneath a table piled high with restoration projects, Yusuf extracted a small, canvas-wrapped parcel tied with faded twine. He placed it gently on the desk. After Arthur Thorne was sent back to England, his personal effects from the dig site were meant to be shipped to him. But Croft intervened. He ordered the crate to be inventoried and disposed of. Farid was in charge of the disposal. He logged the contents as water damage survey equipment, and marked it for incineration. But he kept one small box. He told me he felt it was his duty to save a piece of his friend's soul from that man's fire. Yusuf unwrapped the canvas. Inside was a small wooden box. And inside the box, nestled in yellowed cotton, was a slim leather-bound journal and a single sepia-toned photograph. Eris's hands trembled as he picked up the journal. It was his great-grandfather's field diary. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was frantic, spidery, starkly different from the neat, professional script in his earlier letters. Croft is a zealot, Arthur had written. He calls her the heretic queen. He refuses to see what is before him. This is not a goddess. This is a woman. A king. The iconography is clear. She holds the crook and flail, she wears the Kepresh crown. But she is depicted as the consort, the equal of the judge of the dead. Croft sees it as blasphemy. I see it as a revolution. Eris's heart hammered against his ribs. He then picked up the photograph. It was slightly out of focus, clearly taken in haste. It showed a section of a painted wall inside a tomb. A cartouche. But the symbols within it were unfamiliar, a combination he had never seen in any dynastic list. Beneath it was a depiction of a woman's face, her profile serene and powerful, her eyes lined with kohl, staring into eternity. This was the anomaly, the piece of evidence that unraveled everything. This was what Croft had tried to erase. The journal was more than a diary, it was a witness statement from the past. And it contained something else. Tucked into the back cover was a folded, brittle piece of drafting paper. Eris carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn sketch of the tomb's layout. It showed the antechamber, the sealed burial chamber, and a dotted line indicating a hollow space behind the western wall, with a small X, marking a specific spot. Below it, his great-grandfather had written a single chilling sentence. He thinks he has buried her. But he has only buried the entrance. The journal was a Rosetta Stone for a history that had never been written. Eris spent 2 days locked in his cheap hotel room, devouring his great-grandfather's words, the pages a fragile bridge across a century of silence. Arthur Thorne's neat, technical entries devolved into a frantic, desperate account of a man watching his life's work being systematically destroyed by the very person he once admired. He chronicled Sir Malcolm Croft's escalating obsession, his refusal to accept the evidence before his eyes. Croft, a man of rigid Victorian sensibilities and a deep, unshakable belief in a patriarchal, divinely ordained kingship, could not accept a female ruler who claimed power outside the traditional lineage, especially one who seemed to usurp the religious authority of the great gods of Thebes by aligning herself so closely with Anubis, the more personal demotic god of the passage of the soul. He saw her not as a historical figure, but as a dangerous ideological threat, an ancient feminist heresy that he believed would destabilize the very narrative of pharaonic power he had dedicated his life to upholding. The journal was the proof Eris needed, but it was also inadmissible. Yusuf had risked everything to give it to him, and to reveal it publicly would expose the old archivist to Zahi's wrath. A historical document without provenance was just a story. He needed official access to the tomb itself, to correlate Arthur's map with the satellite data and force the council's hand. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed an ally on the inside, someone with the authority to challenge Zahi and the courage to risk their career. His thoughts turned to Dr. Lena Haddad. He had met her a few years prior at a symposium in Berlin. She was one of the council's rising stars, a sharp, forward-thinking Egyptologist who specialized in the religious texts of the intermediate periods. Unlike Zahi, she wasn't a dogmatist. During a panel discussion, she had cautiously questioned the neatness of Croft's chronologies, hinting that the official records glossed over periods of intense social and religious upheaval. She had been quickly and publicly corrected by one of Zahi's senior colleagues, but Eris had seen a spark of defiance in her eyes. Finding her was his only hope. He requested a meeting, and to his surprise she agreed, suggesting a small, neutral cafe far from the museum district. She arrived cloaked in a professional caution, her expression unreadable. "Eris," she said, her tone polite but distant, "I was sorry to hear about your meeting with Dr. Zahi. He can be unpersuadable." "He's a gatekeeper for a single story," Eris countered, deciding that directness was his only option. He pushed the GPR printouts across the table. He refused to even look at this. Lena studied the images, her practiced eye immediately recognizing the significance of the anomaly. A flicker of academic curiosity broke through her reserve. "It's remarkably clear," she murmured. "The geometry is undeniable." "Now look at this," Eris said, sliding the brittle, hand-drawn map from his great-grandfather's journal across the table next to the satellite data. He watched her face as she compared the two. The dotted lines on the century-old paper matched the spectral void on the modern scan perfectly. Her eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's from the private journal of my great-grandfather, Arthur Thorne, the lead surveyor on Croft's 1923 expedition." He then told her everything, the stories from Yusuf, the contents of the journal, Croft's fanatical suppression of the discovery of a heretic queen. He didn't show her the journal itself, holding that back as his final, most precious piece of proof. He was asking her to take him on faith, to trust his intuition over the established dogma of her entire career. Lena sat back, her mind clearly racing. The implications were immense. If Eris was right, it meant that Sir Malcolm Croft, the patriarch of modern Egyptology, was a fraud. It meant the institution she worked for was built on a deliberate, calculated lie. It was career suicide to even entertain the notion. Zahi would destroy anyone who brought this forward, she said, more to herself than to Eris. He would call the journal a forgery and me a co-conspirator. He would, Eris agreed. Which is why we don't go to him with a historical theory. We go to him with a safety concern. Lena looked at him, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "The area around KV-64 is geologically unstable," she said, quoting Zahi's own excuse back at him. "You're right. He said so himself. A subterranean void of this size, previously unrecorded, could pose a structural risk to the adjacent tombs in the event of a seismic tremor." A slow, determined smile spread across Eris's face. "It would be irresponsible not to investigate. A limited, non-invasive survey to assess the stability of the bedrock. We wouldn't be looking for a lost queen. We would be ensuring the safety of the Valley of the Kings. It's his own protocol. He can't refuse." Lena was silent for a long moment, the weight of her decision hanging in the air. She was standing at a precipice. Behind her was the safety of her career, the respect of her peers, the comfort of the accepted narrative. Before her was a leap into the unknown, a dangerous alliance with an academic pariah based on a ghost story and a map drawn by a dead man. "To get the permit, the request has to come from a senior council member," she said finally, her voice firm. "It has to come from me. I'll need to see the journal, Eris. All of it." Eris met her gaze. This was the moment of truth, the transfer of trust. He saw not a careerist but a true scholar, someone for whom the truth, however dangerous, was the ultimate prize. He nodded slowly. "It's in my hotel safe. I'll bring it to you tonight." The alliance was forged. They would challenge the dragon not by attacking him head-on, but by using his own armor against him. The quest for Nephthys Irit was no longer a solo obsession. It was now a conspiracy. The week it took to secure the permit was the most tense of Eris's life. Dr. Lena Haddad proved to be a masterful tactician. She presented her proposal to the council's safety committee, framing the survey of the geological anomaly near KV-64 as an urgent and necessary precaution. She used Zahi's own words, citing his concerns about instability and the paramount importance of preserving the necropolis. She never once mentioned history, a lost queen, or Eris Thorn. Zahi, caught in the web of his own bureaucratic rhetoric, was cornered. To deny the request would be a dereliction of his stated duty. He agreed, but with a palpable, simmering fury. The permit was granted, but it was heavily restricted. They were allowed a team of 2, Lena and a consulting surveyor of her choice, for a period of 48 hours only. They were permitted to use ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors to map the void, but any form of excavation was strictly forbidden. And they would be accompanied at all times by 2 of Zahi's own security men, a clear message that they were being watched. Lena designated Eris as her surveyor, a move that sent ripples of shock through the council. Zahi was livid, but the permit was already signed. He could do nothing but let it proceed, certain they would find nothing but rock and humiliation. Their journey to Luxor was a silent, anxious affair. The drive into the Valley of the Kings felt like a descent into another world. The sun beat down with a merciless, physical force, baking the limestone cliffs until they radiated a shimmering heat. The air was thin and utterly still, the silence broken only by the hum of their vehicle's engine and the distant cry of a bird. The site of KV-64 was just as Arthur Thorne had described it, isolated, unremarkable, and ignored. A thick, modern concrete slab, gray and ugly, blocked the entrance, stamped with the official seal of the Antiquities Service. It was a gravestone for a secret. Zahi's 2 guards, burly men with impassive faces, watched their every move, their presence a constant, oppressive weight. They set up their equipment under the punishing sun, the silence of the valley amplifying the soft beeps and clicks of the sensitive machinery. Eris felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo. He was standing on the very spot his great-grandfather had stood a century ago, armed with technology Arthur could never have dreamed of, preparing to prove the old man's desperate theories true. Lena worked with a cool professionalism, directing the placement of the sensors, her voice calm and steady as she called out readings. But Eris could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the anticipation in her eyes. They began the scan, a low hum vibrating through the soles of their boots. On the laptop screen, a digital cross-section of the Earth beneath them began to form, line by painstaking line. The first few passes showed exactly what the satellite data had predicted: the known excavated chambers of KV-64, and then to the west the clear, dark outline of the hidden void. Was there? Solid, undeniable proof. The dimensions matched the GPR data exactly, Lena said, her voice a carefully controlled murmur. It's approximately 10 meters long by 5 meters wide. Perfectly rectangular. But the map from Arthur's journal had shown something more. A specific point of entry. Eris recalibrated their smallest, most high-resolution seismic imager, focusing its energy on the interior wall of the known antechamber, the spot his great-grandfather had marked with an X. Focus the pulse right there, he said, pointing to a spot on the cliff face that corresponded to the interior wall. Give me a density reading. Lena keyed in the command. The machine whined, sending a focused vibration deep into the rock. They watched the screen waiting for the echo. The result appeared a moment later, a complex wave of colors and numbers. Lena's breath caught. My God, she whispered. What is it? One of the guards asked, stepping closer, his suspicion piqued by her tone. The limestone here is solid, Lena said, quickly composing herself and pointing to a section of the readout. Consistent density. But here, she indicated the target area, the return signal is different. It shows a layered structure. Limestone, then a gap of a few centimeters filled with a material less dense than rock, plaster most likely, and then another layer of limestone. It's a sealed doorway. A false wall. Eris felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the seismic equipment. He stared at the screen, then at the silent, sun-bleached cliff face. The entrance was there. Right there. They had found it. His great-grandfather's map had been true. His intuition had been right. They had peered through 100 years of lies and found the seams. One of the guards spoke into his radio, his voice a low, urgent stream of Arabic. He was reporting to Zahi. The clock was ticking. Their 48 hours had suddenly become much, much shorter. They had the location, the proof of a sealed chamber, but their permit forbade them from taking the final step. They were standing on the threshold of the greatest discovery in a century, separated from it by a few feet of stone and a wall of bureaucratic hostility. The sun began to dip towards the western cliffs, casting long dramatic shadows across the valley floor. The heat abated, but the tension only grew thicker, colder. The real race had just begun. The radio call from the guard had its intended effect. Within the hour, a black SUV roared up the dusty track, kicking up a plume of sand. Dr. Halim Zahi emerged, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He strode towards them, his expensive suit now powdered with fine, pale dust. He ignored Eris completely, directing his anger squarely at Lena. "What is the meaning of this, Dr. Haddad?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Your permit was for a stability survey, not a treasure hunt. You have exceeded your authority." "We have found a significant structural anomaly, Director," Lena replied, her voice steady despite the immense pressure. "A sealed entrance within KV-64's antechamber. Protocol dictates we investigate any feature that could compromise the integrity of the tomb's construction." "Protocol?" Zahi scoffed, his eyes blazing. "Do not hide behind protocol. You have been conspiring with this fantasist. You have used this council's resources to chase a discredited ghost story." He turned his venomous glare on Eris. "And you? You have plagued this institution with your family's delusions for years. This ends now. Your survey is terminated. You will leave the valley immediately. Your findings will be sealed, pending a review by a committee I will personally appoint." Was a checkmate. Zahi would bury their findings in endless bureaucracy. The committee would conclude the anomaly was an unfinished, abandoned chamber, and the false wall, a simple structural repair. The secret of Nephthys Irat would be entombed for another 100 years. Desperation clawed at Eris. He had come too far. He looked from Zahi's smug, triumphant face to the impassive rock of the cliff. In that moment something broke inside him. The years of caution, of academic decorum, fell away, replaced by a raw, burning need for the truth. "She wasn't a goddess," Eris said, his voice quiet but carrying an intensity that made everyone freeze. Zahi stared at him. "What did you say?" "The woman buried in there. She wasn't a mythological warrior goddess," Eris continued, taking a step forward. "That was the first misinterpretation. She was a woman. A ruler. A pharaoh. My great-grandfather saw the evidence before Croft destroyed it. He saw the Kepresh crown, the crook and flail. Lies and fabrications," Zahi spat. "The ravings of a broken man, passed down to his equally delusional descendant. Then why did Croft seal it?" Eris shot back, his voice rising. "Why did he confiscate every note, every photograph, and replace them with a single-page report calling it insignificant? You don't bury something insignificant under concrete and a century of silence. You bury something that terrifies you. Something that shatters your entire worldview." He saw a flicker of doubt, of uncertainty in Lena's eyes. He had to push harder. "We don't need to excavate," Eris said, his mind racing, improvising a new strategy. "There's another way." He turned to Lena. "A fiber optic endoscope. We have one in the survey kit. We just need to drill one small hole. 1 centimeter in diameter. Through the plaster layer of the false wall. We can look inside without compromising the seal. We can see the truth without moving a single stone." It was a brilliant loophole. It was technically non-invasive. A survey, not an excavation. Lena's eyes lit up. "He's right, Director. It's a valid diagnostic technique. We can verify the nature of the void without any structural damage." Zahi was trapped again. His guards were witnesses. To refuse such a minor logical step would look like a cover-up. His face contorted with rage, he gave a curt, angry nod. "One hole," he hissed. "And when you find nothing but limestone dust and cobwebs, you will be permanently barred from every site in Egypt. And you, Dr. Haddad, will be stripped of your position and credentials." The stakes were now absolute. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, as darkness enveloped the valley, Eris carefully drilled a tiny hole into the spot their imager had identified. The drill bit punched through the outer layer of limestone, then met the softer resistance of ancient plaster. Finally, it broke through into open air. A faint, musty smell, the scent of trapped millennia, puffed out of the hole. Eris's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his ears. He took the endoscope camera, a slender, flexible tube, and gently fed it into the darkness. On the connected laptop screen, the image resolved from a blur of black into a coherent picture. The chamber was real. And it was not empty. The camera panned across a space that was not a grand burial chamber laden with gold. It was a library. The walls were lined not with treasure chests, but with dozens of sealed clay jars, the kind used to store papyrus scrolls. And in the center of the room, stark and unadorned, was a simple sarcophagus of black basalt. It was not the gilded coffin of a god-king, but the austere final resting place of a scholar, a philosopher. As Eris moved the camera along the walls, the light caught the faded but still vivid paint. He saw hieroglyphs, texts, a story laid out in stone. He saw the cartouche from his great-grandfather's photograph. And he saw her. The woman. Depicted not as a warrior but as a teacher. She was shown guiding souls, holding scales with Anubis, debating with priests. This was not a monument to power and wealth, but to knowledge and faith. A completely different vision of the afterlife. Zahi, Lena, and the guards were crowded around the screen, their faces illuminated by its glow, their expressions a mixture of shock, awe, and in Zahi's case horrified disbelief. The camera panned to the lid of the sarcophagus. The inscription was simple, elegant, and world-shattering. It gave her name and her title. The King of Upper and Lower Egypt, she who serves the balance, Nephthys Irat. Eris looked at Zahi. The man's face was pale, his arrogance shattered. The lie he had dedicated his life to protecting had just crumbled into dust on a laptop screen in the middle of the desert. The forgotten queen had spoken her name for the first time in 3,000 years. The sight of the sarcophagus and the library of scrolls rendered everyone speechless. The oppressive silence of the valley was broken only by the hum of the laptop. Dr. Zahi stared at the screen, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, denial, and the dawning horror of a man watching the foundations of his world dissolve. He had built his career on the pristine legacy of Sir Malcolm Croft, on a vision of Egyptian history that was orderly, patriarchal, and predictable. This chamber, this heretic queen, was none of those things. It was a cataclysm. Lena Haddad was the first to speak, her voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. We have to open it. Officially. This changes everything. Zahi, snapping out of his stupor, shook his head, a reflexive gesture of control. No. This changes nothing until the materials are properly contextualized. The site is sealed. Effective immediately. A full report will be filed. But his voice lacked its earlier authority. The power had shifted. The truth was no longer a theory, it was an image on a screen witnessed by 4 people. Eris knew this was his only chance. Zahi would try to rebury Nephthys Irat in committee reports and academic debates, spinning the narrative to minimize the damage to Croft's legacy. He had to get inside that chamber. The scrolls, Eris said, his eyes fixed on the laptop. She left her story. The answer isn't just in her title, it's in her words. We have to retrieve them. An emergency session of the council was convened in Luxor the next day. The atmosphere was electric. Lena, now emboldened, presented the endoscope footage. The images of the scroll jars and the sarcophagus sent a shockwave through the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Zahi, looking drawn and defeated, had no choice but to authorize a full, formal opening of the sealed chamber. It was a painful, public capitulation. A small, elite team was assembled, led by Lena. To the council's astonishment, she insisted that Eris be a primary member. He was no longer the outcast, he was the key. Days later, they stood before the false wall again, this time not with drills and cameras, but with the careful tools of an official excavation. The work was painstaking. Under the glare of television cameras from around the world, for the news had leaked, becoming a global sensation, the team meticulously dismantled the wall, stone by stone, just as ancient hands had placed it 3 millennia ago. When the opening was large enough to pass through, a hush fell over the entire valley. Lena, as the lead official, was the first to enter. Eris followed right behind her. The air that hit them was cool, dry, and utterly still, carrying the faint, papery scent of time itself. The chamber was exactly as the camera had shown. It was a geniza, a sacred repository for texts deemed too holy to destroy. Dozens of scrolls, their clay jars sealed with wax bearing the sigil of Anubis, were stacked in neat recesses in the walls. The sarcophagus sat in the center of the room, a silent, imposing presence. It was a library of a lost soul, a lost era. 4 weeks, they worked, carefully cataloging and removing the scrolls for preservation. Each one was a revelation. They were not simple religious texts, but philosophical treatises, legal reforms, and personal poetry. They detailed the reign of a woman named Nephthys Irat, who had ruled during a brief, chaotic period between the Middle and New Kingdoms. She had not come to power through war, but had been elevated by the priests of the Anubian cults during a time of famine and religious corruption. The established state religion, centered on the powerful and wealthy priesthood of Ammonius Ra, had become detached from the people. Nephthys Irat's reformation was radical. She promoted a vision of the afterlife that was not dependent on wealth or priestly intervention, but on personal piety and moral conduct. The weighing of the heart ceremony, but democratized, with Anubis as an impartial and compassionate guide, not a terrifying god. She had tried to strip power and land from the bloated temples of Thebes and redistribute it. She was, Eris realized, a threat not just to the priests of her time, but to the very idea of divine absolute monarchy. Her reign was short. The scrolls told of a violent counter-reformation led by the Ammonius priesthood, who branded her a heretic, overthrew her, and systematically erased her name from every monument, every king list, every record. Her loyal followers had created this hidden chamber to preserve her body and, more importantly, her philosophy, her words, hoping that a future age would be ready to understand it. They had created the outer tomb, KV-64, with its confusing, seemingly amateurish warrior goddess iconography as a decoy, a blind to mislead any who might stumble upon it. It was a work of genius, a message in a bottle cast into the sea of time. The final, most crucial discovery came from a small, unassuming scroll Eris found tucked inside the sarcophagus, beside the queen's carefully wrapped mummy. It was her own voice, a final testament written in the last days of her reign. She wrote not of bitterness or defeat, but of hope. "They will erase my name from stone," she wrote. "They will call me a ghost, a heresy. They will build their temples of gold and power over my memory. But stone crumbles. Gold is plundered. Power fades. A word, once written, can sleep for 1,000 years and awaken with the same fire it was forged in. I do not pray for my own soul. I have been weighed and found true. I pray for the one who finds these words. May you have the courage to listen." Eris read the translated lines, tears welling in his eyes. He had found her. He had listened. The heretic queen was not a heretic at all. She was a reformer, a philosopher, a woman who had been centuries ahead of her time. And now her voice was finally being heard. The final piece of the puzzle lay not in an ancient scroll, but in the brittle, ink-stained pages of his great-grandfather's journal. After the triumphant public revelation of Nephthisirat's story, Eris retreated from the media storm, seeking a quiet moment to close the circle. He sat in his Luxor hotel room, the journal open to its final, unread pages. He had saved them for this moment, wanting to understand the modern part of the cover-up only after he fully understood the ancient one. The last entries were written in London, months after Arthur Thorne's return. The script was shaky, the words stained with what looked like teardrops. He described his final devastating confrontation with Sir Malcolm Croft in the latter's study at the Royal Society. Arthur had begged Croft to reconsider, to publish the truth about the tomb. Croft's response, as recorded by Arthur, was chillingly frank. It was the confession Eris had been searching for. "He looked at me not with anger but with a terrible pity," Arthur wrote. "My dear Arthur," he said, "you see only the stones? I see the foundations of civilization. What you have found is not history, it is chaos. A female king not by divine right of succession, but elevated by a popular cult? A philosophy that places a personal moral ledger above the authority of the state gods? What does that sound like to you?" Eris's blood ran cold as he read on. "It is the language of schism," Croft continued, his voice low and intense. "It is the template for Martin Luther, for Oliver Cromwell, for every rabble-rouser who has sought to tear down God-given order and replace it with the anarchy of individual conscience. Our field, our entire understanding of the ancient world, is built upon the stability of the pharaonic line, the divine right of kings. To introduce this precedent, would be to hand a weapon to every anarchist, every feminist, every Bolshevik who wishes to see our own modern world crumble. It would suggest that our own traditions of monarchy and faith are not timeless, but arbitrary and open to revolution." There it was. The motive. It wasn't about academic integrity. It was about preserving a worldview, a political and social order that Croft felt was reflected in, and justified by, his interpretation of ancient Egypt. He wasn't an archaeologist in that moment. He was a censor, a guardian of a fragile, patriarchal status quo that he believed was threatened by the ghost of a long-dead African queen. "He told me I had a choice," the journal concluded. "Silence and a continued career or ruin. He said he was not destroying history, but protecting humanity from a dangerous idea." I looked at the artifacts he had on his desk, the pure, serene face of Nephthisirat on a pottery shard, and I told him that a truth that could be destroyed by a single story was no truth at all. That was the last time I saw him. My funding was cut the next day. The whispers began. My reputation was undone. He did not just seal a tomb, He sealed my life. Eris closed the journal, a profound sadness washing over him. He finally understood the depth of both tragedies, the ancient queen erased by priests, and the honest scholar erased by an academic zealot. His quest had not just been for her, it had been for Arthur too. The time had come for the final confrontation. He requested a private meeting with Dr. Halim Zahi. They met not in Zahi's grand office, but in a small, sterile records room in the museum's basement, surrounded by the ghosts of other forgotten stories. Zahi looked older, diminished. The scandal had tarnished him, forcing him into the humiliating position of overseeing the complete reversal of his mentor's most famous non-discovery. Eris didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his great-grandfather's journal on the table between them and pushed it forward. "This is why he did it," Eris said quietly. "Not for science. For ideology." Zahi opened the journal, his hands trembling slightly. He read the final entries, his face growing paler with every line. The detailed, first-hand account of Croft's confession left no room for doubt, no possibility of reinterpretation. It was a testament to a crime against history, motivated by fear and prejudice. When he finished, he closed the book gently as if it were a sacred text. He looked up at Eris, his eyes stripped of all their former arrogance. In them, Eris saw not an antagonist, but a man grappling with the wreckage of his faith. "I have spent my life defending this man's legacy," Zahi said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I believed he was a paragon of scientific objectivity. I built my entire worldview on his teachings." "He was a man of his time," Eris said, finding an unexpected well of empathy. "A time that was afraid of women, afraid of change, afraid of ideas that challenged their own. But we are not. We can't be." Zahi nodded slowly, a silent admission of defeat and the beginning of a painful acceptance. "What you have done, Dr. Thorne, you have not just excavated a tomb. You have corrected the course of a river. It is a painful correction for many of us, but it is a necessary one." The unveiling was complete. The hidden in plain sight culprit was not just Croft, but the entire system of thought that had enabled his deception to stand for a century. In that quiet basement room, surrounded by the silent records of the past, the torch was finally and definitively passed. The age of Croft was over. The age of Nephthisirat had begun. The world's reception of Nephthisirat was nothing short of revolutionary. Her story, broadcast from the heart of the Valley of the Kings, captured the global imagination. She was the forgotten queen, the philosopher king, a voice of startlingly modern-sounding reason and faith speaking from the depths of antiquity. The discovery sent shockwaves through academia. Entire university departments convened to reassess the timelines of the intermediate periods. Theologians and philosophers debated her vision of a personal, accessible afterlife. She became a feminist icon, a symbol of a lost matriarchal wisdom, her serene, powerful face from the tomb paintings reproduced on magazine covers and protest signs. For Eris Thorne, the aftermath was a whirlwind. He was no longer the disgraced outcast but a celebrated hero of history. Universities that had once rejected his papers now vied to offer him professorships and research grants. He was inundated with requests for interviews, lectures, and book deals. But he found his greatest satisfaction away from the glare of the cameras, in the quiet, climate-controlled labs where Lena Haddad and her team worked tirelessly to preserve and translate the Queen's library. Each newly deciphered scroll added another layer to the portrait of this extraordinary woman. They discovered her astronomical charts, her legal reforms granting property rights to women, and her poetry, which spoke of love, loss, and the eternal search for balance in a chaotic world. The Egyptian government, under Lena's guidance, announced the construction of a new wing of the Cairo Museum, dedicated entirely to Nephthisirat. It would not be a hall of treasure but a hall of ideas. Dr. Halim Zahi, in a remarkable act of public contrition, personally oversaw the project, ensuring that the story of Croft's cover-up was included as a stark lesson in the difference between archaeology and ideology. He and Eris developed a quiet, professional respect for one another, two men bound by the same seismic event in history. One day, weeks after the media frenzy had subsided, Eris stood alone in the newly opened wing of the museum. The centerpiece of the exhibit was not gold or jewels, but a single illuminated papyrus scroll, Nephthisirat's final testament. Behind it, on a large screen, a digital projection showed her serene face, reconstructed from the tomb paintings and the features of her mummy. Nearby, in a simple glass case, lay Arthur Thorne's leather-bound journal, open to the page with the hand-drawn map. A small placard told the story of the honest surveyor whose integrity had finally been vindicated. Eris felt a profound sense of peace, of completion. The wound that had plagued his family for a century was finally healed. He had not only restored a lost queen to her rightful place in history, he had reclaimed his great-grandfather's name from the shadow of disgrace. He had given justice to the forgotten. A young Egyptian girl no older than 10, stood beside him, staring up at the image of the queen. She looked at Eris and asked in clear, curious English, was she really a king? Eris looked from the girl's bright, hopeful face to the calm, wise eyes of Nephthisiret projected on the wall. He thought of her courage, her wisdom, her unbreakable faith in the power of truth to endure. She was more than a king, Eris replied, a soft smile touching his lips. She was a teacher. And she waited a very long time for her students to arrive. The girl smiled back, a look of understanding on her face, before turning her attention back to the ancient queen. Eris watched her for a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving the two queens to their silent conversation across 3,000 years. His work was done. The story was no longer his to tell. It now belonged to the world, and to the generations of a future that Nephthisiret had so patiently waited for. The river of history, long diverted, was finally flowing in its true course.